I want to preface these introductions by saying that every one of these people has far, far more on their vitas and resumes than I'm even hinting at. So I encourage you to look at the full author bios and even go to the websites to find out the depth of accomplishment of these people today. Starting alphabetically, Gar Alperovitz is Lionel R. Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland and a co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative. To his left is Colleen Cordes, a public policy consultant and director of outreach and development for the Nature Institute of Ghent, New York. Thomas Pally, to her left, is the senior economic policy advisor at the AFL-CIO. And Sean Sweeney on the far left my far left, is co-director and founder, I believe, right, Sean, of the Global Labor Institute, which is a program of the Worker Institute at Cornell University. He's based in New York. And all of these folks are authors of chapters in the current edition of State of the World. Let me start with Gar with this canned prompting question, and then you're welcome to take it anywhere you like. Gar, one of the key themes of the book, as we've heard several times today, is the need to build a powerful bottom-up movement capable of pressuring governments to take action on sustainability. And you write in your chapter that there are strong reasons to believe that the politics of sustained green mobilization cannot work unless there's a baseline of economic health. How can that capacity be created?
Actually, those who were here for, I assume most people are here for the last panel, I want to take that question just a little more broadly. I should say first that I was Gaylord Nelson's legislative director, so I come out of that world of both politics and also the environmental movement. And in those days, significant to know that Gaylord Nelson was a labor lawyer. And he was able to put together the power of the labor movement in support of his election and also to do interesting things on the environment. And that was true of most of the liberals at the time that passed most of the legislation that we now live with, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, et cetera, et cetera. And it is critical, I think, to understand that it was not simply a participation of large numbers of people in an activist movement, the environmental movement. It was the linkage of that movement with an institutional power base, sometimes fighting with it, called the labor union, that was able to elect liberal congressmen and senators. And most of the environmental movement has kind of ducked that point, but there was a power base associated with and critical to the movement part of that movement. That's over. Labor unions at that point in time had 34% of the labor force in membership. They are now down to 11% total, 6.6% in the private sector, and disappearing. So the institutional muscle base of the progressive movement in general, and I would contend the people you need if you want to enact powerful environmental legislation, has disintegrated. That's a very intense period of American history if you accept that analysis. We could go on at length about it. And my contention is not only that we need economic health, people will vote against regulation if it means you lose jobs, that one everybody knows. It is further that unless, and this was Senator Raskin was talking about this, unless we begin also simultaneously to build an institutional power base, not just a movement, that can work hand in hand with the politics of the new movement, we're not going to be able to alter any of the big trends. So that's a long, obviously we had time, I try to go into that, and it's not only environmental trends, it's income inequality, wealth inequality, civil liberties, et cetera, et cetera. They're all going, virtually all the major trends for 30 years with minor ripples have been going down. So the question is there anything developing in the country at all that suggests the possibility of alternative institutional power slowly growing out of pain, I would contend, that begins to suggest a different power base that might be an ally of the environmental movement and also important economically and in terms of equity? And the answer is yes, and the question is how far and how long that will go. And the way to think about what's going on now, I would suggest, is if you look at the prehistory of the New Deal, What was happening at the grassroots level in the state and local, quote, laboratories of democracy, in primitive form, slowly developing over 3 decades out of social and economic pain, became the elements which then generalized, were moved into national power and politics. They were labor law started that way, Social Security that way, welfare programs that way, minimum wage that way, all preliminary, scattered around different states, then became generalized when the time was right. We shall see if that happens in the current place, but let me give you some idea of what's going on. Jamie mentioned the B Corp, which is a new form of corporation, and I think there are 20 states now which permit the establishment of a private corporation, which when you invest in it, you know that it may not prioritize profits. It will prioritize profits and some social goals, so that going in, and environmental goals are top of the list right now. I think there are 20 states that now passed this legislation to create economic institutions. This is the most conventional one, which in the heart of the institution is a different set of values by law. So that's building up one institution that becomes a potential ally of the next movement as an institution. There are also worker co-ops are developing all over the country. Worker co-ops are a form that anchors jobs in communities critically. Worker-owned companies do not get up and move. And that's critical if you want to begin to do any sort of serious planning for the environment in many, many communities. If you want to do sustainability planning, you need a stable economy. Worker-owned companies, 30 years ago, there were very, very few. There are now some 11,000 of them. More than 10 million people are involved. That's 3 million more that are involved than are currently involved in labor unions in the private sector, and they are expanding. And they are an institution now finding more and more people wanting to integrate environmental values as well as ownership cooperative values. But critically, they also stabilize jobs in given localities so that you can begin to work on environmental issues alongside highly stable rather than the corporations that come in and go out. So they're part of the possible buildup of institutions. There are co-ops. Most people don't know that 140 million Americans are members of co-ops. That's a democratized ownership structure in the United States. Most of that comes out of the past, but now there are many, many more forms of co-op that are beginning the same, developing a different vision of what the good society is. Critically, it's an institution. 20 states have introduced legislation to establish state-owned banks. Very interesting, like the Bank of North Dakota, which are, quote, these are socialized banks. They don't call them that, but that's what they are, making money for the state. And in North Dakota, backed both by the left, right, center, the small businessmen and the farmers, and some cases beginning to have an environmental aspect as well. Critical point, though, it's an institution, not simply a policy, not simply legislation, and not simply a movement. It is an institution that embodies different values that becomes part and parcel of a long-term possibility. So given the time available, I can't really go through this, but something called the New Economy movement has been developing around the country and just beginning to get press on this. And a lot of young people are involved in trying to further these goals. It has to do with local food as well, which is another part of this puzzle. But the critical point I want to underline is there is something bubbling that's creating institutions which could be part and parcel of the next movement. I want to shift gears slightly, given, again, my time is probably running out, but I want to say a couple of words about long-term trends. I'm a great admirer of the Chicago School of Economics on one or two issues. Chicago School of Economics, as you know, is the heart of conservative economics in the country. Milton Friedman was trained there. The early Chicago School of Economics theorists, and I bow to them, they were men of great integrity, though conservative, and I'm certainly not. Is that 6 for me? Oh, good. Got it. I've got timing here, so I've spent 6 minutes. How many more do I have? Okay, good. I thought you were saying I got another 6 minutes. I was just winding up. Yeah. Well, I want to make this point because it begins to suggest possibilities for the long haul. The Chicago School of Economics was serious about a free market competitive economy, and they believed freedom and democracy depended upon that form of economy. They did not, like most liberals, and I was working I've come out of liberalism, Wisconsin liberalism, where you regulate the corporation if you can. They did not believe, and they had an institutional analysis, that you could do that effectively, and one of them won a Nobel Prize for the following argument, because the corporations because of their institutional power, leave aside good, bad, critical, this is an analytic point, would inevitably capture the regulators. That was their theory. So they said that won't work. So the alternative was, let's break them up. And that would be the traditional antitrust policy, to break up their power. And they also understood they would then regroup. The big fish would eat the little fish, and we'd be back in the same situation. Now remember, these are conservative economists, not liberals. And so the question Milton Friedman's revered teacher and the founder of the Chicago School of Economics, Henry C. Simons, looking at that problem, said, if you can't regulate them, and you want a free market, and you can't break them up, you must socialize them. This is from the free, and they meant it, that the only option available was to turn those that were not accessible for regulation or breaking up had to be turned into public corporations. And I think that issue, I think, as we go down the next decades and build up more and more of these institutions coming out of pain, I think that question may pose itself. It posed itself, we did in fact nationalize General Motors and Chrysler and AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, and de facto at least three of the Wall Street banks. And I suspect over time that question may begin to be posed about the oil companies as well. Now, I'm not a utopian, I'm a historian and a political economist. To say as much is to say that we are entering a period, and I would leave this as a suggestion for how to frame some of this, a period in which the traditional liberal regulatory approaches that I was involved with and when I worked in the Senate are not available to us. Try as we must to do the best we can. The power relationships do not permit us to do what we need to do, I believe. And so I think things are going to get worse. And secondly, as many economists now realize, and we have an author who's written a book about it, and a very good book, we are entering a period of stagnation, a period in which this growing social and economic pain develops more and more, creating the conditions of movement building or pain. And I think we're into a long, long period in which the developmental processes, some of which I've sketched here, may begin to go forward hand in hand with the development of the kind of movement that Senator Raskin talked about. We shall see. But I think some of the things you see in Maryland, if you actually look at what Jamie Raskin's been doing, follow that pattern and I think exemplify what can be done, building on the institutional side and building on the political side, and the growing pain and the growing realization, above all in the environmental movement, that we are losing, and that unless we develop much more robust ideas that include citizen organization, but go well beyond it, we will continue to lose. Enough said. Thank you.
Thanks, Gar. Lots of interesting questions in there, and a nice segue to Colleen in mentioning the B Corps. It's not exactly a socialized corporation concept, but I wonder if it's a kind of soft socialization in a way. Is it a step in the right direction along those lines? It's not just greenwashing, right? There's something serious going on here.
Yeah, I do think that this is indeed a minor revolution that's happening, and it's the most exciting thing about it is that it's being led by businesses and corporate lawyers. So first, just to kind of lay out the landscape. Can everyone hear me?
Keep it closer. Just use this one.
It's working. You have to get close.
Is that pretty good?
Right into it.
Yeah, so a benefit corporation is a new legal status, and when Jamie was here, he said something like 13 states. It's moving very fast. It's now up to 22, and in a few days it'll or soon it will be probably 25, because there's 3 states that have a statute going to the governor's office, even as we speak. So, and that's way up since when I wrote this chapter in October also. Anyway, a benefit corporation in these statutes, and they're all pretty much the same because they're based on model legislation that B-Lab helped get going. But basically the statutes state that if you choose to elect, if you elect to become a benefit corporation, then you either, in your original or your amended articles of incorporation, you require yourself as a company to have a general purpose of trying to have a positive social and environmental impact, as well as trying to make money. You also, according to these statutes, you're requiring yourself, your board of directors to have a fiduciary responsibility to a broad range of stakeholders, not just their shareholders. And it specifies that those stakeholders are to include your own workforce, the workforce of your suppliers, your customers, your local community, and the broader society, and local and global environment. And then the third really key point is that you're requiring yourself to annually and publicly analyze how well you're doing in terms of having a positive overall impact socially and environmentally. And you have to do this according to a transparent, credible, and third-party independent assessment tool. So this is really, and this is something that businesses, along with B Lab, which is this nonprofit, have been quietly going state to state and arguing is very much a pro-business agenda and getting generally passed without much controversy. Delaware is one of the states in that 22 to date. It has something called a public benefit corporation, and in this chapter, I try to spell out how it is different from the other states. And there's enough differences there that people need to watch that really closely. And even B Lab has publicly stated that they hope that law gets strengthened over time because it doesn't have the same transparency in terms of its reporting requirements. And it also doesn't spell out that you have to have a general overall impact, a general purpose of having a positive social and environmental impact. You can pick one particular public benefit that you're going to work for. And then overall, you're agreeing that you will try to have you will operate in a sustainable and responsible way. But, over time, sustainable, that doesn't exactly say environmental sustainability, so there's some concern there too. Now, in terms of other numbers, there are now more than 600 benefit corporations in the United States, and that's up from less than 400 at the end of October, so again, it's growing fast. About 100 of those are in Delaware, which is a big thing to have a state where so many publicly traded companies incorporate, because now they have that option in Delaware. Also, there are partly I've talked about B Lab. B Lab has something called certified B corporations. So when you talk about B corporations, it's actually different from benefit corporations. B corporations is a private certification that B Lab gives companies. And when you get that certification, it doesn't mean you have to become a benefit corporation, but you are required to move towards establishing in your charter documents that you have a responsibility for a broad range of stakeholders. And if you're in a state that doesn't have a benefit corporation statute yet, then you become part of the lobbying group with B Lab to go to that state and say, hey, we want benefit corporation legislation, because we want the legal protection that if we make decisions that don't necessarily maximize our shareholders' financial returns, we have it established in our articles of incorporation we have to also consider the social and the environmental impact of what we do. So, and also just in terms of the internationally, what's happening now, B Lab has been going around the world creating partnerships. There's now a B Lab Europe, there's a B Lab Australia, New Zealand. In South America, there's a Sistema B, and there's also an office in Canada. So around the world, it would probably be a different statute, obviously in different countries than what the US has. But in each of those countries where they need legislation to allow companies to actually establish in their basic organizing documents that they have a social and environmental responsibility as well as they're trying to make money, then these international partnerships will be trying to also change laws in all of these other countries too, to really make this a growing international movement. So besides B Lab, there are two other really key groups that are part of this story. One of them is Green America, which is the first nonprofit to organize a green business network. They've been in the business since like 1983. And they really set a standard that I think B-Lab was able to grow with for a very rigorous certification based on your social and your ecological practices. And they continue to be, they have promoted the idea of benefit corporations. The third organization is the American Sustainable Business Council, which is one of these new institutional players. Really exciting group. If you haven't checked them out yet, they will blow your mind. I got an email from them back in January of 2013 saying, come on out and rally with us against the Keystone XL pipeline, and they lobby for increase in minimum wage. They're concerned now about making chemicals safer. They're just a very, very forward-looking group, and they see what businesses who care about the ethics of what they're doing and care about their own long-term future, that you don't have to separate out doing good from doing well financially. And that in the long term, for most companies, if you don't do good, if you do bad and you get caught, you're not going to do well in the long term. But they're really coming from a very positive, energetic place. And I have to say, just talking with folks with some of these companies and some of these organizations, it's hard not to be really excited because they are entrepreneurs. And many of us are social entrepreneurs. They are social and business entrepreneurs, and they know how to do things, and they know how to move, and I think it is really exciting. And one thing that hasn't happened yet is the nonprofit community, the public interest advocacy groups getting connected with them. And some nonprofits have actually been concerned that it's a threat, that maybe investors would rather invest in a benefit corporation than give money to a nonprofit that isn't ever going to be able to return any kind of investment return. And that maybe there will be organizations that will form a benefit corporation, and they'll be able to raise capital and put out some of the service providers that are nonprofits, put them out of business by maybe being able to underbid them or that sort of thing. And then other nonprofits, on the other hand, are wondering if maybe they should become benefit corporations themselves. So that's, in terms of service providers, or some of the groups are thinking about that. One thing that, in terms of nonprofits being skeptical, like some, environmental groups, I think, are kind of holding, some of the smaller ones probably are holding back, waiting to see how this all goes, and is this greenwashing? But I think we have to be aware of, I work for another nonprofit myself. Where does our money come from? Is it coming from the conventional, amoral, capitalistic system? Even now, it's turning around. We're trying to do good things with it. And do we annually publicly report with some third-party independent assessment tool about what our overall, how well we've been doing in terms of our overall social and ecological impact on the environment every year? So I think that there's some things here that we can grow from too, in terms of the nonprofit community. The other concern, I think, is will it be co-opted? As it becomes popular and there's a buzz around green businesses, some of the companies, this happened with the Washington state campaign about labeling genetically modified foods. Plum Organics, which is a benefit corporation in Delaware, was held up by folks who are concerned about GM foods, saying, if you've got a baby or a toddler, buy Plum Organics. It's one of these foods we know won't have genetically modified organisms, in its production. And meanwhile, Campbell's Soup has bought up Plum Organics, and although Campbell's Soup was fine with Plum Organics as a wholly owned subsidiary becoming a benefit corporation, Campbell's Soup, both before and after Plum Organics became a benefit corporation, spent something like $384,000 total to lobby against that Washington initiative, which, polls have shown most people would like to know. They'd like to know whether, they're eating GMO foods or not. So, so that to me is an example of one of the dangers ahead. And what I really think would be great is if the if all of us, as customers, if we get beyond cheap, just like we are hoping companies get beyond the single bottom line, we have to get beyond that single bottom line of cheap. And when we invest our money, we've got to get beyond that idea that our primary thing is to maximize our return. As citizens and grassroots groups, I think it would be really wonderful if the benefit corporation movement had much more active engagement with the corporate watchdog groups and the grassroots advocacy groups to really grow this movement and shape it and protect its rigor and make sure that its assessment tools are really broadly reaching out into the real human rights and environmental, the really rigorous agendas in these areas. And not to say that they're not now, but they're much what they need, I think, what the larger community that's been advocating for years on these issues can contribute. So the one last thing I'd like to say is I see this as a kind of a new technology, and this is the kind of disruptive technology that we need to revive the future of life on Earth. Thank you.
Thanks, Colleen. That's really interesting, and I want to pick up on what you said and what Gar has said about these aspects of socializing the capitalist impulse, and ask Tom, who's got a chapter in the book on the financial community, in which he writes that financialization has been an engine of an economy that gobbles up growing amounts of scarce resources, even as it distributes the product in ever more unequal ways, and ask is this one of the ways you think finance could be put back in the box and made to serve the real economy rather than the other way around?
Well, absolutely. I mean, what Gar and Colleen have both said about institutional innovation is essential to changing finance and to changing the structure of our capitalist economy. And that's actually where I want to kick off I think the most important thing I can say this afternoon. But my talk is about, my comments are about financial markets and financial governance, and that's the chapter in the book. But in some ways, that's an issue that I think environmentalists have not usually been interested in, and yet I think it's an absolutely critical issue. And when I go to meetings with environmentalists very often, I always think they have a fantastic vision and fantastic ethics, but sometimes it does seem to me they appear to operate in an economic vacuum. And by that I mean they don't address the political economy that is producing environmental catastrophe. And understanding that political economy is absolutely essential to finding our way to solutions. And that's in fact how I want to talk about how financialization is about how finance fits into that political economy and how finance drives that political economy. And that's why finance should be an absolutely essential issue to all of you. Now, I work with labor, and I believe that understanding our political economy can actually create an unbreakable bond between labor and environmentalists. And that takes us back to where Gar's opening comments were about his experience some 30 years ago. Now, again, you start here, and this is a connection with what Colleen's just said. In my view, financial markets have a much broader purpose than just the efficient allocation of capital on behalf of shareholders, which is the traditional view. That broader purpose is to contribute what I would call shared prosperity, by which I mean full employment, rising incomes, contained income inequality, and here's the environmental contribution, and a sustainable environment. Can't possibly have shared prosperity without a sustainable environment. So join the conversation about shared prosperity, because sustainable environment has to be a critical thing. I think when I've written about it in the past, by the way, that has not been something I've written into it, and it is something I'm going to be increasingly putting into my work. And so I would say that we clearly don't have shared prosperity on all those metrics, those economic metrics and those environmental metrics. And I think therefore we have to go, so how did this come about? And I would say that we need a little bit of history here, that you roll the clock back to the period 1945 to 1975. We had an economy that I call a Keynesian virtuous circle economy, and I describe in the book. Economic logic was very simple. You had productivity growth driving wage growth fueling demand, demand fueling full employment driving investment, investment driving productivity growth, and the circle is closed in a way that produces shared prosperity. And by the way, that shared prosperity environment and the foundations behind it created the political conditions in which we could deal with the environment. Remember how dirty Pittsburgh was 50 years ago? It was because of the shared prosperity environment that people were then willing to engage in that. So again, that kind of gets back to why shared prosperity is so important. And in particular, finance in this model was what I would describe as a public utility model based on New Deal regulation. It provided business and entrepreneurs with finance for investment, provided business and households with insurance services, and it provided households with business and households with transaction services, and it also provided households with a mean to save for the future. Well, then in the 1980s, so sort of, obviously 1980, 1979, Mrs. Thatcher in Britain, Ronald Reagan here in the United States, we began to pull that market apart. And what we did is we put workers in a box and then surrounded them by economic policies that, one, severed the link between wages and productivity growth, and second, abandoned full employment. That's the economic piece of it. And then we erased, talking specifically about finance, we erased the New Deal system of financial regulation. And the result then is a system characterized by wage stagnation, rising income inequality, and accelerating climate damage. And behind that, you have to then understand what's the political economy that's driving this new set of arrangements. Well, that's where financialization enters into it, and the role of finance. Because finance, in a number of ways, has pushed the system. In fact, finance now owns the system. We see how it owns the political system. There's no doubt about that in our minds. But we have to understand how it owns the economic system as well. Finance, I'm talking Wall Street here, used its political power to promote the policies on which this new model rests. So it lobbied for all the deregulation that we've seen, obviously in the financial sector, but also across markets throughout the economy. It supported the shift in macroeconomic policy away from full employment to an exclusive focus on inflation. That's away from a concern with working families' well-being to really, in broad terms, a concern with the well-being of financial capital. It supported corporate globalization and expanding international capital mobility. These things have been disastrous in terms of global environment. I mean, if you think of the diesel fume that gets, the destructive diesel fumes that get spilled out across the Atlantic and Pacific every day. It's all part of globalization, not taken into account when we talk about the benefits of globalization. It supported privatization, the regressive tax agenda, and the general shrinking of the state that makes it so difficult now to put these things back in the box. And of course, it supported the attack on labor and labor unions, which again draws in, you get the undermining of shared prosperity, which means people are less inclined to deal with the environment. Freud said about psychoanalysis, my wife is a psychoanalyst, that you can't do psychoanalysis when you're hungry. Well, I think there is an element of that too when it comes to dealing with environmental issues. People will put the bread for their families before the environment, and that's something you're well aware of that. But if you attack unions, you attack labor, you undercut the economics that will support environmental change, and you undercut the politics. Anyway, finance also, and this is the most important piece to understand, and it connects to Colin's business thing. It took control of American business and forced it to adopt financial sector behaviors and perspectives, this rationale of shareholder maximization with regard to nothing else, and of course that nothing means the environment as well. So therefore I'm interested in how can we restore shared prosperity, how can we restore a sustainable environmental situation, and that means putting finance back in the box, for getting working families to go along with that agenda, means connecting wages to productivity growth. That's that whole economic rebuilding agenda is beyond the scope of today. I'll just talk about some things that we can do regarding putting finance back in the box. Well, of course, one part of the challenge is political and concerns the campaign finance reform. The political power of finance rests on money, so we have to take money out of politics. There can be no doubt about this. The environmental movement and the labor movement have to work together on getting this out. This is critical. And it's a problem because I think that more for you than for us, your money may come from well-to-do donors and corporations who may not have an interest at all in that. A second part is we have to change corporate behavior, and that's the corporate governance agenda that I think Colin was talking to, and there's more that can be said about that. And the third part is simply regaining control over financial markets so that we make them serve society. And here are 4 technical reforms to close with. Well, obviously, Part one is getting control of the Federal Reserve, and I think we've made some nice steps in recent months. The appointment of Janet Yellen was a really wonderful appointment, and things that she said has since being appointed, we're going to make full employment a priority again rather than just inflation. It is amazing reading things like the President's economic report, how the notion of full employment disappeared from the text after 1980. It's all there before, but then it disappears. We need tough Dodd-Frank style regulations on finance. Won't talk about that. A financial transactions tax, which I think many of you are familiar with, that can raise a hell of a lot of revenue. It can help shrink a financial sector by discouraging unproductive trading. And that money, most importantly, can then be used to finance the type of investments that we need to combat climate change. And by the way, of course, to the extent that this is something the environmental movement is ahead on, to the extent that we are going to need the price of carbon, it has to be raise the price of carbon to deal with environmental destruction. The money that comes from that must go back to the people and must not be handed over to corporations. Now, finally, the last thing I would like you to do, to consider, it's in the chapter, is I have a proposal called asset-based reserve requirements that basically extend margin requirements to a wide array of financial assets held by financial firms. So all these firms have to hold these reserves against different classes of assets, and the regulatory authority, the Federal Reserve, would then be able to adjust those reserve requirements on the basis of its concern with each asset class. So, for instance, if you want to stop a house price bubble, this is what where the idea came from for me, I would without raising interest rates, because raising interest rates damages the entire economy, what you would instead do would impose reserve requirements on new mortgages and leave the interest rate unchanged. You therefore don't damage manufacturing, you don't damage the whole economy, but you do make new mortgages more expensive because the banks have to hold some cash on each loan they make, and therefore you can target the house price bubble. Now, this is very relevant for the environmental movement because they're a great way to deal with climate change. Why? Well, what we can do is we can encourage investment in climate change mitigation activities by providing reserve credits for loans and for that finance such investments. This is how you can turn the whole massive weight of Wall Street to start working on behalf of investment in climate change, investments that deal with deteriorated city centers, that sort of thing. So anyway, this is the big message here for me. Finance matters. You have to understand how it fits in driving this environmental destruction process, and we have to think about how to collar finance. The particular thing I would mention today is asset-based reserve requirements to think about and put into your work. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Tom. This is terrific. I think all the speakers so far have touched on aspects of socializing the capitalist impulse that Sharon has looked at from the perspective of the energy system. And in fact, he calls for reclaiming the energy system for the broader public interest by reversing privatization and developing a socially owned system based on renewables. Sean, take it away.
Thank you, Tom. And I've learned so much from these contributions, it's kind of hard to follow. I'm a little bit intimidated by some of the comments that have already been made in a good way. I totally concur with what Gar said about the need or the rise of the new economy movement. I think that's very important. But my comments, I think, are going to speak to the need for some real sort of traditional kind of top-down planning approaches, especially to energy in order to address, among other things, the climate challenge. I think I'd start off by saying that business as usual in the energy sector globally is just not an option. We cannot allow the expansion of extreme energy, increase in fossil fuel use globally. All the data coming out of the International Energy Agency, the Energy Information Administration, World Bank, is that fossil fuels will continue to supply the bulk of the world's energy well into the 2040s and 2050s. It's an unacceptable scenario. It means, of course, again, according to those same institutions, between 4 degrees and 6 degrees Celsius of global warming in the lifetime of children born today. That is an unacceptable scenario. We have to do something about that. So even if anything else I say about the need for democratic control of energy doesn't resonate with you, then that I hope will, that we do have a planetary emergency, a civilizational crisis, and we have to start behaving as though that crisis is real. The second reason is 21 of the top 50 world's corporations are energy corporations. They're not all privately owned, let's be honest. This is not just a question of public versus private. Many marketized parastatal companies in China, South Africa, Russia, India operate as multinationals, as private companies. They are either partially owned by the government or completely owned, but so we have to reclaim to the public interest those companies. But there are lots of private-owned companies, the Exxons, the Chevrons, you name it, the Royal Dutch Shell, the big coal and gas companies that need to be taken into public ownership if we're going to stop their agenda from being completed, and with all of its implications. The system of energy at the moment is based on profit and consumption. It's built into the system that the more electrical power, for example, they sell, the more money they make. So where is the capacity to reduce demand in that system? If anything, it's about expanding more and more energy demand and more consumption. This, again, is an unacceptable scenario. Privatization, what that did for energy markets was, if anything is emblematic of the failure of the neoliberal model, is what's happened in energy. You've had a ridiculous unbundling of energy. The idea that energy companies are competing and consumers can make real choices has been blown out of the water by many, many researchers in the trade union movement. Public Services International Research Unit talked about the ludicrous premises on which this is based. Secondly, the liberalized energy markets have also led to an investment crisis. No private investors really want to go near the energy system anymore. Massive upfront money in terms of fossil fuels and centralized generation. Banks don't want to lend the money. Renewables companies are facing, ironically, a glut in supply on the supply side, so not enough demand. So there's lots of renewable companies around the world going under at a time when they should be prospering. So nobody wants to go near it. And it's also, if we look at, I live in New York City where Hurricane Sandy, it was clear what happened. The Utility Workers Union issued a report. The run it till it fails approach of a privatized, deregulated corporation led to a response to the crisis which was totally inadequate. Hundreds of thousands of people without power for weeks because the company did not know their way around their own company. They contracted out so many aspects of the company. They didn't even know their way around. They had exhausted the workforce with a lockout some months before. When those workers went back to work, they were working 7 days a week to do catch up on maintenance. Then the hurricane hit. They had to continue to do that. They didn't have enough staff. They brought in 4,000 extra workers who didn't even know where Brooklyn was. It was a disaster in more ways than one. It showed in very real and immediate terms the problems of the liberalized markets and run it till it breaks policy. It's tough on workers. I don't think I need to go into too much detail about that. But the more fossil-based power goes from the global north to the global south, the more repression happens. We've had massacres in Kazakhstan, in South Africa, in Colombia, Mozambique. It's a serious problem of repression in the industry, to say nothing about the health impacts of pollution. The World Health Organization says that 1 out of 8 deaths in the world today is in some way related to fossil fuel exposure, the exposure to particulate matters and other carcinogenic materials. So there's a health or an air apocalypse, as it's been termed, around the world. So I don't see how business as usual, whether it's climate or health or worker conditions, can be tolerated. We have to address this problem. Now, what is energy democracy and how can it do it? I want to spend the remainder of my time maybe focusing on that a little bit. I would urge you, though, maybe the chapter I wrote tries to deal with it. I'd like to acknowledge the help of my Worldwatch friend, Mike Renner, who's not here today, who's been a real ally in a lot of this thinking. But the first thing is to say is that We cannot decarbonize supply without addressing the issues of demand. This has come up in earlier questions. The only way to do that in a capitalist approach to energy is by raising the price dramatically through a carbon price, which then gets passed on to consumers. That's politically dead in the water right there. Because mainly poor people then become very vulnerable to the encouragement or the exhortations of the fossil fuel companies, who then become champions of the lower class and the poor. We've seen this even in the United States. This is true globally as well. So I think that's a real problem. If we're going to reduce demand, we have to have massive investment in energy conservation. And that means that energy, and electrical power in particular, needs to be a public good. If it was a public good, then conserving it is a lot easier than if it's a commodity. If you have to raise the price in order to drive action, then you've got a problem on your hands. That's a bit of a complex idea, or at least trying to be, but I don't have time to go into details to explain it more further. Again, my colleagues at Public Services International talk about the price of public financing versus private financing. It's cheaper for public entities, for governments, municipalities to borrow money than it is than private corporations. And the private model of energy, which is now for renewables, is based on power purchase agreements, which lock in profit for corporations, renewable energy companies, for the next 20 or 30 years. This, again, adds expense to renewable energy, and the public take on the risk, and the corporations gain the profits. Guaranteed. We get the risk, they get the profits. I think that's a serious problem with power purchase agreements and the whole public-private partnership model. There are technical challenges that need to be addressed that the liberal approach or neoliberal approach to renewable energy is not capable of addressing. One is the grid. The grid needs to be upgraded. Nobody wants to put up the money to upgrade the grid to allow more renewables to come into the system. Even Germany, which is of high penetration of renewable power relative to other countries, still only 10, 15, maybe 20% on a good day. But that's very, very high on world standards. Most countries are way below 5%. They are now confronting the issue, who's going to pay for those grid upgrades? How do we get smart grids? How do we get the technical upgrading of the system? In many cases, a very old system, in the US in particular, like 40, 50, 60 years old. The fourth reason I would say that that I think is hopeful for energy democracy is that what they call the techno logic of renewable energy lends itself to more democratic input and participation. We don't need as much centralized power anymore. There is a lot of potential in decentralized photovoltaic in particular, but wind and other forms of renewable power. There's a debate in the labor community internationally about this. Some people think it's naive of those who advocate for renewable energy to think that decentralized power is going to meet all our needs, but that raises the question of what are our needs and how do we reduce demand? How do we control the consumption of electrical power? I'm a little bit agnostic on it. I think there's a real role for energy cooperatives. I think there's a role for individuals, the prosumer model. I think there's some problems with that. That's where people produce their own electricity and sell it to the grid, the sort of feed-in tariff model. I don't have time to go into some of the problems with it, but I can certainly come back to it if there's time. But I'm more confident in municipalities like in Germany taking control over electricity. And at the moment, the main control is procurement. They're buying now electricity from renewable sources, but are segueing into their own generation of their own power, which, given decentralized technologies, given solar PV in particular, allows them to do that in ways that was not possible in the past. But I'm informed, I think, my own ideas are informed, and I'll conclude on these couple of points, by FDR's approach to rural electrification in the 1930s and 40s. 10% of farms had electricity in 1935. It was almost 100% less than 15 or 16 years later. It was a phenomenal accomplishment which could be done again, a similar renewable energy electrification program done in the public sector, borrowing from public banks. Finance is hugely important, I acknowledge. I think that's the way to go. Taking control of global supply chains is also important. At the moment, renewable energy technologies are produced in only 4 or 5 countries, and increasingly China. If we have guaranteed demand, then we have the basis for building a manufacturing base in the US, whether it's done publicly or privately, is secondary. We need those jobs in the US. Workers and unions, energy conservation, mass transit, decarbonization of transport is a big job creator. We need a new deal around renewable energy and decarbonized transport that really can drive job growth. My very last point, under social ownership, the very notion of energy can be redefined. We have to start asking the question, why are we producing all this energy? We produce massive amounts of energy, new energy every year. 1.4 billion people on the planet have no access to it. It's polluting the environment. Most of it goes to agriculture, industry, inefficient buildings. If we have control over it, we can actually address those issues as well. So I think energy democracy is not just about power generation. It's not just about public versus private, but it is about control, social ownership and control over the energy system as really a lifeline to save what is really a threatened species at the moment. Thank you very much for the opportunity to say these words.
Thank you, Sean, and thanks, panelists, for demonstrating once again that Worldwatch doesn't just whine about the problems. We offer people who have thought about these things and have some solutions. So great, great panel. I think we'll go to questions, and I see some already. So, okay, we'll start over here. And the gentleman, and then the young lady who asked the question in the previous panel. And then we'll pick up some others.
Dan Lieberman. It seems with the increased productivity that the ultimate route is to increase real wages, and which increases the purchasing power of the workers. But is there an alternate way of saying, instead of increasing the wages, I know it's possible, lower the prices, which also increases the purchasing power, but has that added benefit of making exports cheaper, which helps the balance of payments? Is that extreme suggestion, or is that worthy of possibility?
Who's that directed to? Oh.
Absolutely. I mean, what you're talking about is margin suppression, and we absolutely need it. Once upon a time, unions were able to actually do that. They actually policed prices in a sense by the productivity went to workers. We totally need it now, though. The profit share is at an all-time high. It's part of the problem of stagnation. We know deposits are piling up in corporate bank accounts and not being recycled back into the economy, and that's part of the reason why we keep on having this need for additional stimulus. But I'm not quite sure how it helps with the problem of that's an absolutely critical piece about shared prosperity. I don't see the connection, though, to the environmental question that is the focus of the conversation today. But yes, margin suppression, I'm for it. Corporations' profit margins are at record highs.
Okay, the second one, young lady in glasses, and then we'll go to Isaac, and then in the back of the room.
Thank you. I was just wondering if anyone in the panel, or specifically, I was thinking about Professor Pally, if you could just, comment on the kind of the notion of kicking away the ladder and how the developing countries face a lot of challenges in basically environmental regulations that are imposed on them in their way of like industrializing and developing. And they often accuse developed countries in kicking away the ladder for them to develop by imposing stricter environmental laws. How do we address this, and how do we kind of develop sustainably without undergoing and foregoing the environmental goals? Thank you.
Well, I understand the kicking away the ladder references to a book by Ha-Joon Chung, which is about the difficulties that developing economies have in pursuing a development agenda in the current world of globalization, where the policy toolbox is greatly restricted by the trade agreements and limitations, investor rights, And a lot of it is also self-imposed, by the way, by taking on board neoliberal economic policy advice that those economists recommend otherwise, and also from the World Bank and the IMF, who insist if you want finance from us, it comes with conditionality. I think that there's some of that is, that's very true of the neoliberal policy agenda. But the type of policy agenda that I and other fellow trade unionists have worked with pushing, I don't think is a kicking away the ladder approach. For instance, I think labor standards is putting in place the ladder by enabling a social arrangement that enables the workers in developing countries to participate in the productivity and share in the productivity that they produce. I've argued for something called a global minimum wage system, which is different from a global minimum wage. A global minimum wage would impose a single level of minimum wages that obviously, if we were to impose a US or a European minimum wage on a developing country, they couldn't possibly meet because they don't have the productivity. A global minimum wage system would say, no, what you're going to do is in every country, we're going to tie our minimum wage to actual wages, let's say the median wage in the economy, and we'll make the minimum wage, this up to policy discussion, and we'd have to do the research to see what's the optimal setting, but we might make the minimum wage 50% of the median wage. We all then compete on the same rules. So I'm not, why? Because we all follow the system, no favoritism for one group or another, and the minimum wage is tied to local productivity conditions, so you don't lose the possibility to compete. And by tying it to the median wage, we actually create the type of minimum wage system that I think works. As the economy becomes more productive, median wages rise, but the floor then rises with that productivity. And that's exactly what we failed to do over the last 50 years. As we became more productive, the floor fell away because we never adjusted up with the minimum wage. So there's lots of institutional change we can do, rule change, that is putting in place the ladder. The trouble is, the neoliberal model does, I believe, kick away the ladder. But we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. We don't want to become opponents to doing anything globally on the basis that it's kicking away the ladder. Far from it. Working cooperatively and putting in place progressive global rules, progressive global governance that will limit all of us to some degree is actually putting in place the ladder for everybody.
Okay, we'll go to Isaac, and then we'll go to the back, and then I think we'll end the questions in time for dessert, which is David Orr.
I'm Isaac van Melle from the Netherlands. Unfortunately, our country is not doing very well in renewables. We only produce 4%. We really are at the bottom of the line in Europe. But I like to comment on what Sean said about Germany. It's correct, but only a few years back. The actual situation is that Germany and Denmark, they both produce now 25% of their power from renewable sources. And on a good wind and sunny day in Germany, they produce 100%. And a very windy day in Denmark produces even more than 100% power. And they don't know what to do with all the power. They pay Sweden, for instance, to take it. Imagine. So I just wanted to make this remark that Germany has now evolved quite a bit beyond what you said.
I'm pleased to hear that.
One more question, I think. In the back, somebody had one. There we go.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all of the panelists for a very important topic that clearly many of us here believe needs to be addressed, which is how to move to a new economy. My question, there's one question for the whole panel, and one question for Professor Pally in particular, so I'll start with that one. Professor Pally, I've just come from an announcement by J.P. Morgan Chase and the Nature Conservancy, and I know about other initiatives, Citibank and so on, that are and others on Wall Street that seem to be trying to address some of these issues. Do you think that they will make any difference, first of all? And for the whole panel, we have seen that Sandy seems to have awakened the financial institutions since they were directly affected by it. But how and what do we do to get to get to where we want to go from here? Thanks.
Good questions, and panelists, can you do your level best to keep your answers succinct?
Well, I'll tell you what, I will answer just the first part and let the others then go to that. My approach to Wall Street's engaging with and big business in general engaging with environmental and climate changes, great. Let them go ahead and do it. But I also have always in the background of my mind that it's not enough. I mean, it's the same debate as over the welfare state. People always put charity versus the welfare state. I'm all for charity, but charity never comes up to scale to deal with the scale of the problem. And there's always a great danger that charity can then be used, this is why I objected to the old 1,000 points of light rhetoric, which it then gets used to substitute in place of the welfare state, and therefore actually becomes the enemy of the real solution. And that's exactly the same solution when business engages with the climate change and says that we are going to do it by ourselves. Can't be done. You're going to need regulation to collar all these people and collar the bad actors so that they are forced, there are good actors out there, but you can only collar the bad actors and stop them from creating the race to the bottom and forcing the good actors to abandon the good choices by having some sort of regulatory system. It applies nationally, it applies globally, it applies to the environment, it applies to the welfare state, it applies to so many activities, and that's my response. So go ahead, JP Morgan, but we're still going to have to change the rules in which you act.
So, in response to the second part of the question, at least my sense of response, what is striking me, two things strike me. I think we're in a period where the question of policy, I mean, all of us could lay out very important policies. They are not within range of the power that we have, the institutional and political power. So what you're seeing on this panel is very interesting. You'll find a range of issues, including socialization of the energy system, what in fact is a planning system for finance by changing the deposit structures. It's where you allocate capital, different institutions, and I was suggesting that there are many other institutional power bases. This is a kind of prehistory of a building towards a different power base, able maybe one day to achieve what we thought we could do in the 60s and 70s. So I think that opening up all of these questions, including policy, which is at the end of the line, you can't do policy until you've got a power base that can get you there. I think this is a critical what's happening in the environmental movement in general, beginning to lay down and sketching out where we need to go over the next decade or two, as we think about both policy and institution building and power as we build new power and new institutions. So I think that's the panel, and the answer is let's get on with it, as many, many people are doing around the country now.
I would certainly agree with both what Gar and Thomas have said, and I guess I would just use a moment to bring up an issue that we haven't talked about, that I mentioned in a footnote in my chapter, which is advertising. That even many wonderful, not all, but many wonderful sustainable businesses that are striving to be socially responsible and ecologically responsible haven't yet grappled with this question of advertising and what its impact is on our culture and on our families and just on our public conversation, what we're allowed to even articulate. I mean, what we allow ourselves. It's a kind of self-censorship, I think, that comes about because we know what we all value, but in our secret recesses of our hearts and souls, we actually do value some other things too. And that advertising doesn't, advertising sets this tone of what we can talk about publicly and what we can talk about policy-wise. How we have to justify and rationalize why we're going to promote a particular policy, whereas we know that we're talking about a real, a historic moment in time where we've got to reach in really deep and we have to respond with real solid values. And I think advertising really gets in the way. There are a few even benefit corporations. Patagonia has taken a very public position on advertising that they don't want to advertise because they, not to say that they think they're great in every way, but, they recognize, and maybe they don't have to advertise, but nonetheless, they've raised this publicly as advertising isn't really good for us. It's a form of education. It's a form of miseducation that our children are exposed to more hours being educated by advertisements than they are in schools, or by their parents. And I think it has a real impact on adults. I've worked for a group called Psychologists for Social Responsibility, and there is a real psychological literature on the impact of advertising on ecological activism and ecological lifestyles, what people are willing to politically demand and what they are interested in changing in their own lives. And when people are constantly primed for materialism and narcissism, their sense of identity, their sense of self shrinks to, their own person and maybe their immediate family, and they're not willing to sacrifice for the future and for people around the world and for other species and for fresh water and things like that. And when you look at the word sacrifice, it sounds like a pretty horrible word, but it means to make something sacred. And so it's like, okay, what is sacred to us? And are we willing to, because when you think of what's sacred to you, you get energized about protecting it. So I think that if we could somehow reclaim the idea of sacrifice, and if we could all take on publicly the idea that this amount of advertising, basing so many big companies, basing their whole product is selling our life information, surveillance, and selling the surveillance data. Let's take on advertising and let's reclaim the word sacrifice.
Thanks, Tom. I had a thought in my head, but I want to respond quickly to the sacrifice idea. I think when you think about what's sacred, a lot of people in the room would consider children and grandchildren extremely sacred. And that resonates with ordinary people, which is why you see opinion polls, even despite all the efforts of the right wing, the desire for some action on climate change is still pretty high. It went down during the peak of the Tea Party to about 51, 52%, but now it's gone back up again. And it's gone up to the high 60s and 70%. So people want action, they're just not sure what that means and whether they're going to have to pay or what's going to have to change. So we have a job to do in explaining that. But I think one of the other dimensions of it is that extreme weather has now become part of the political equation. This probably wasn't the case very much in the US before Katrina, but we've seen, not just with Sandy, but people I know in the Midwest saying that it was and the South, it was the fires that really changed a lot of people's minds. Week after week, people woke up in the morning smelling smoke, seeing a haze on the horizon, suffering respiratory distress because of out of control bushfires. And in Australia, similarly, the climate consciousness has changed because of extreme weather. We've seen it in the Philippines with Typhoon Yolanda. We're seeing it in China and India with the monsoon. So I think weather is part of the politics, and that can be a tool in many ways to educate people, not just on the need for climate protection and mitigation, but the need for viable public services. This is the demand coming out of the nurses union, for example, in the US, who sent 3,000 nurses to the Philippines in a relief effort, only to find there was no basic medical facilities. So a climate demand becomes a health demand, becomes a trade union demand, becomes a working class demand. So this is all part of a new narrative around sustainability, which I think is important. So the weather is important because it changes a lot of other things. But the last point I will say is this. 7 or 8 years ago, I think many people were kind of besotted with the idea that liberal solutions, the theory of ecological modernization, that all we needed to do was substitute green growth or bad growth with good growth. It's a bit like cholesterol. Your physician says, you've got good cholesterol and you've got bad cholesterol, and good news for you, your good cholesterol is up and your bad cholesterol is down. But the same system runs, the same stuff runs through the veins. And I think this is wrong. I think the idea that we have to have a level playing field between fossil-based and renewable energy, that we need to have, incentivize to mobilize private markets, maybe to some extent. But the most important thing is that we have control. And that's also a message, going back to Petra's comment in the earlier panel, last point, is that's a message that will actually encourage people to get out on the streets, because it means the solution is real and not confusing and false. And I think that's the message of hope I think we can take with us in terms of how the climate is affecting politics in a very important way. Thanks for Tom.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, panelists. We'll leave that there. Very good.